last time we had a crisis that was in 2010 to 2012, the euro crisis. And at the time, we were very lucky that we were surrounded by friends, or at least by realistic partners who assessed the situation and concluded that it was in their best interest that the euro survives. And that was true of the US, that was true of the UK, that was true of China largely. So the main partners, I wouldn't say that was entirely true of Russia, but that's a different story. But the main partners, they were positively inclined. This time, it's not the case. The US under President Trump is openly wishing the dismantling of the EU. We have a very difficult relationship with Britain, as Britain is in the process of leaving and the discussions are still going on. And we have a China that has been building clienteles inside the EU by providing support to various countries and using that as a way to build its own influence inside the EU. And it clearly does not regard the EU as an entity with which it shares the same worldview. I mean, we have partnerships, for example, on climate. We can do some good things together, but we shouldn't consider, obviously, that China is a friendly power. So we are very different environment, and therefore it's important that there is a strong European response, because without a strong European response, I mean, things could go the other way. I mean, it's, the market reaction resonates with the policy reaction. And last time the market understood at some point that, whatever they may have thought of the future fate of the euro, there was sufficient internal reaction and sufficient external support for this bet to be a losing bet. This time we have to be stronger, definitely. So I think in this regard, what's happening with the discussions around the recovery package, all the discussion we had in the ECB response, and beyond all the discussion on how to reshape the EU as a consequence of this crisis are of absolutely major importance. There is a new theme, which is the theme of sovereignty. And in a way, it was there before. I sort of wrote with others on it a year ago. And the question arose from the fact that, again, we had the US and China behaving like powers, power that were very conscious of their sovereignty, and which in various ways were using economic instruments sort of to push geopolitical goals. I mean, with the US, it was a shock for the EU when the sanctions against Iran were enforced in a way that de facto prevented EU companies from continuing to do business with Iran, and on a purely unilateral basis. And that was a demonstration that the US was really ready to advance its own agenda without any consultation, without any regard for the European priorities and concerns. And at the same time, there was a growing realization that trade and especially investment with China is not entirely determined by economic considerations, and that we had politically motivated investment, acquisition of companies inside the EU, All that in the context of a growing concern about the Chinese behavior and the lack of convergence of China on the sort of, economic principles that are underpin, for example, the WTO. So there were also this concern that you had to do something, get ready. This was the KUKA affair in Germany that was a sort of a wake-up call for Germany. And I was very impressed actually by the change in attitude that we can observe in Germany from the corporate sector, the BDI, the professional association, as well as from the government. The tone is entirely different on the relationship with China compared to what it was. So that was already there, this notion that Europe has to redefine the way it assesses its sovereignty, and it actually has an agenda to defend, to promote its sovereignty. That was there, and then came this crisis. And the crisis led everybody to the observation that access to a deep and liquid global market may not be sufficient to ensure your autonomy as regards essential equipment, medical equipments, medicines, etc. And that again was a sort of a shock because, I mean, we had lived under the hypothesis that, you've got to specialize, you're specializing according to your comparative advantage, you're doing it for economic efficiency, and you don't have really to worry about access to whatever global market is going at all times to provide you with the possibility to access the goods and the services you need. And this crisis and this, this drama about masks, with everybody trying to buy masks and protective equipment, and actually there was virtually only one supplier in the world, and that was China, and everybody was competing on getting access to Chinese supplies. That came as a realization that there's something wrong, and that you have also to plan for situations in which markets are disrupted. It doesn't mean you don't want to access global market. That doesn't mean you want to sort of, rebuild a sort of entirely self-reliant economy, even at European scale. That just means that you have to wonder what are the conditions under which you may be cut off from essential goods and services. And what do you do to prevent that? And that's opening a new discussion. Now, it is a difficult discussion because we're not in a sort of simple consensual environment. I mean, there are a number of protectionist forces in Europe. So balance would be difficult to find. And all that comes against the background of grievances against globalization that have made globalization a much less appealing proposition than it was 10 years ago. People blame globalization for all sorts of things. They blame globalization for inequalities. They blame globalization for disturbances to the state of nature, to climate. They blame globalization for the financial disruptions we've seen. So there's a whole list of things globalization is blamed for. And so in this context, if you say, I want to reassess my autonomy, my security of supplies, that means it's not an easy discussion to have. Here, again, I think the European dimension is really essential. I mean, we are a very large economy. We have a very large market. We have a very large economy in terms of production capacity. we certainly don't want to be self-reliant on everything, but we have to think about the risk. I mean, it's a matter of risk assessment. You know, what are the risks? What are the risks you want to control? And how do you want to do that with a dimension of collective security? It reminds me in a way of a you know, not exactly similar, but you know, not completely dissimilar problem, which is energy security. On energy, we have very few producers in Europe. I mean, we're basically dependent, although there are some producing countries, obviously. And the question that arose in the 70s after the oil shock was, you know, how do we deal with the problem of security? And the answer has been we have to devise a collective security mechanism. So if there is a problem of security of supply affecting a country or a group of countries, they have to rely on their own capacity, but they also can rely on the strength of an integrated market. It's not easy to do because the issues, you know, all the issues we're familiar with, trust, solidarity, who is making the preparation, who is serious in making the preparation, and who is just relying on the others. So all that is involved. But I think we have to get serious about these issues and find common responses. Well, there is a particular issue of the currency. This was again very much emphasized by the Iran affair, because any European company using the US dollar for whatever transaction can be falls under the jurisdiction of the US courts and can be sanctions for relationship with Iran or for relationship with whatever country that is considered, you know, an enemy by the US. So that symbolizes this question of we have a world currency. This is the dollar, but this is not a public good. This is not something that's provided for free by the US to the rest of the world, which is the way we sort of, you know, loosely thought about the dollar. That was the currency of the world. And there were some advantages that the US could derive from it. And there were some famous exorbitant privilege. And we knew that the US occasionally would use this particular structure to its own advantage. But on the whole, we thought the US would do it reasonably well. And so there was no need to find sort of an alternative. And suddenly, the fact that, you know, access to the dollar meant access to US financial market and meant therefore the risk for any company in the world to be sanctioned for that, for the behavior unrelated to its US business, completely different business, but used access to the US dollar used as a conduit for enforcing the sanction. That reopened the question of, you know, what do we have a currency for? What the external dimension of this currency? And this is a question that we did not want to address for the first 20 years of the euro. And I think rightly so, because it had to be built internally. It had to be, you know, all the problems, all the internal problems we had to be solved before we could speak of an external role of the euro. I mean, the motto was neither encourage nor discourage the use of the euro by third countries or by third parties. And that was fine. But now I think we have to take a stance. I mean, we have to decide whether we consider that it is on Europe's interest that more transactions are done with the euro. That that it's more widely used by our exporters, by our companies in general, but more widely by third countries, companies in third countries. And this is not without risks, because as the global financial crisis demonstrated, or even this COVID crisis in the first acute phase of the mid-March, if banks, companies use your currency, you have to make sure that they can get access to the currency at a moment where markets are closed. And that was what led to the establishment of swap lines between the Federal Reserves and a number of partner central banks. So it means that if we want to develop the international role of the euro, we have to do something similar to make sure that partner central banks will have access to euro liquidity in time of crisis, so that they can provide their banks with the euro liquidity. So it's a different type of stance than what we had before. I think we have to be serious. We have to, I'm in favor of doing it. I'm in favor of promoting cautiously, slowly, but of promoting a wider international role for the euro. It's not just a matter of advertisement or political commitment. There are concrete decisions to be taken in this regard. I spoke of swap lines. And we have to be clear also that it's not going to be the solution of all the problems I was mentioning with the US unilateral behavior. The US has been using any kind of link with the US market as a vehicle for enforcing sanctions. So if you have shareholders in the US, if you have clients in the US, you don't need to be using the dollar. It's going to be used. But the currency is a significant part of the whole. Having an internal capital markets that works, that the very purpose of what has been tried and that hasn't yet been completed at EU level or at euro area level, a banking union, a capital markets union. Certainly, financial integration developed, but not in a very sound way. It's basically, money flowing from Northern Europe to Southern Europe, intermediated by banks, and that was not a very sound model, because the day banks realized that the situation in Southern Europe was unstable, they basically withdrew the capital and contributing to the euro crisis. This euro crisis was a sort of massive capital outflow from Southern Europe to Northern Europe. If money had been invested in the form of equity in Southern Europe, we wouldn't have seen the same sort of consequences. The value of equity would have gone down, investor would have taken a loss, but you wouldn't have had this destabilization that you had at the time, with all the banking sector and then the state being put in difficulty. So I think we need a sort of more resilient, more robust financial market, capital market for the EU. The Capital Markets Union, it's a sort of a slogan. It's moving slowly. It's moving slowly for all sorts of reasons, because you have issues of bankruptcy law, you have issues of tax regimes. So we want to harmonize, but at the same time, each of us wants to keep, regulation and taxation the way it is, without harmonizing. So we're sort of inconsistent in this regard. I mean, the convergence of all on the model of market capitalism is probably behind us, right? We have China going for state capitalism, and we have Europe increasingly consensus is developing in Europe that goes in the direction of a more mixed regime that takes into account dimensions that are not just summarized by market prices. I mean, you know, where other dimensions are there. And again, it was there before the pandemic. We had all these discussions about the governance of companies, purpose of companies, actually in the US also, because we have this business roundtable statement in the US about that. The notion that they are stakeholders and not just shareholders, all that were there before. But probably what we've seen in this crisis is also potentially an acceleration of this trend. I think in the pandemic crisis, it was realized by everyone that the social value of activities, of tasks, of jobs is not summarized by their monetary value. That there's something that needs to be taken into account. We don't know exactly how, but this notion that in a sanitary crisis should just depend so fundamentally on the behavior on the dedication of people that are not so well paid, and so that's observation that once you have made this observation. So, you know, this change about the relationship between market and sort of the social norms that underpin life in a society more generally, that's an important change coming out of this crisis. In the same way as this change about sovereignty that I also mentioned is an important lesson. So we have to invent what it means. So we're not ready to get rid of the efficiency or forget the efficiency of the market. We're not learning that again, just to go back to sort of fantasies about the way a government can run the economy. But there is a sort of deeper relationship between social institutions and market institutions that need to be rethought. And, you know, Europe in this regard has some basis. It has a tradition. The labor market was never purely dominated by, you know, sort of purely individual relationship between an employer and an employee, as if you were buying, you know, whatever commodity. That's not the way the labor market works in Europe, even in the countries where it has been the most liberalized. And that's not the way the health market works. I mean, we have a very, in general, we have different type of combinations, but we have a very sort of, you know, government, public, dominated market for healthcare. So I think we have basis, and the question really is how to sort of blend things in a different way, in a way that's more efficient, and that's a big challenge for Europe. So it has started in various ways, but it needs to accelerate and get concrete in a way that responds to the wishes, to the expectations of our fellow citizens. A lesson from the crisis has been for many people that governments are more important than they thought they were. And in a way, that's true. I mean, governments were indispensable in providing the sort of insurance. We all relied on massive government intervention at a time. The shock was too large for private players to cope with it without government intervention. So that's clearly a lesson. But another lesson is that we rely also on communities. We rely on individual behavior that are not dictated by the state, that have to do with the sort of the quality of your social fabric, the quality of the relationship between citizens within communities, and so the notion that you could summarize the issues, the problems we've got to solve on an axis that's puts government at one end and market at the other end is too simple, and a lot has to do with the triangle that involves the community, and that was Sam Bowles and Wendy Carlin said in their paper, and that's also what Raghu Rajan devoted a book to. There is this lesson from analysis that there's just not one model of capitalism. There are, as scholars say, there are varieties of capitalism. And because not every type of economic relationship is determined on a market. I mean, there are institutions, there are norms that are not purely economic norms. And so all that creates various types of arrangements. And in Europe, the EU integration essentially in recent decades didn't value that so much. And didn't value that so much for probably the reason that those models of capitalism were largely national models. And there was therefore a sort of an alliance between those pushing for European integration and those pushing for liberalization and the standard market-based model. That the unholy alliance between Jacques Delors and Mrs. Thatcher that gave rise to the single market. Delors wanted to do the single market for reason of European integration, and Margaret Thatcher wanted to do the single market because that was creating a large unified market. But they were very much in de facto alliance in this regard. And all issues that have to do with sort of deeper social relationship, I mean, the labor market institutions, credit market institutions, companies that have a different purpose, stakeholder economy, etc. That was not that there was outright hostility, but in some cases there was. But they didn't fit in this agenda because each time you were referring to them, you were referring to national features, not to European features. We're probably at the end of this process. We're probably at the moment where unification is far from perfect, but we've gone far, at least in this direction. And the question now is, is there a way, and probably the green agenda is a significant part of it. The sovereignty agenda is a significant part of it. Is there a way to redefine an agenda at European level that's not a pure negative integration, liberalization agenda. That's an agenda that has positive content. And that, I think, what's ahead of us, that we need much more than in the past. There was always some positive content, positive goal, but we need much more than in the past, have this positive agenda that goes beyond integration and that goes beyond the development of market integration.